What would you do if the person you trusted the most turned out to be your greatest enemy? If a single moment shattered everything you believed in? Welcome to the chilling and inspiring journey of Evan Collins, a 15-year-old whose quiet life spirals into chaos when he stumbles upon a human trafficking operation hidden in plain sight. But here's the twist. The one man who should protect him, his father's best friend, is the villain pulling the strings. As secrets unravel and betrayals deepen, this story of survival, courage, and justice will leave you questioning. How far would you go to honor the memory of someone you loved? Stay tuned for the unraveling of shadows of betrayal, where every twist and turn reveals just how fragile trust can be and how resilient the human spirit truly is. Evan Collins trudged along the uneven sidewalk, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his worn hoodie. The chill of the evening air bit at his face, but he hardly noticed. His mind, as it often did, wandered to his father. 3 months, he muttered under his breath. 3 months since Officer Liam Collins had been taken from him. The random armed robbery explanation still didn't sit right. His dad, a man who could read a situation faster than anyone, had been caught off guard? It didn't add up. As he passed the abandoned textile mill, he noticed something unusual. A faint flicker of light emanated from one of the cracked windows. Evan stopped, narrowing his eyes. The building had been a derelict eyesore for years. Probably just some kids messing around, he thought. But his feet betrayed his caution, leading him closer. Curiosity gnawed at him. His father always said, "Trust your instincts, Evan. They're usually right." The thought spurred him on. He crept toward the building, the shadows of the looming structure swallowing him whole. Evan slipped through a gap in the chain-link fence, his sneakers crunching softly on the gravel. The light was brighter now, coming from deep within the mill. He pushed open a rusted side door, its groan echoing ominously. Inside, the scene was surreal. Rows of crates stacked to the ceiling, a group of men huddled around a table strewn with cash and weapons, and, most chilling of all, a cluster of bound and gagged people. Evan's heart pounded in his chest. He fumbled for his phone, his trembling hands raising it to capture the evidence. The camera's light was off, but the faint click of a button made him freeze. One of the men's heads snapped toward the sound. Evan ducked behind a stack of crates, holding his breath. "Did you hear that?" One of the men barked. Heavy boots thudded against the floor as someone approached his hiding spot. Evan swallowed hard, clutching his phone like a lifeline. When the footsteps retreated, he seized the chance and bolted for the door. His heart was a drumbeat in his ears as he burst into the night. Evan didn't stop running until he reached the familiar glow of Havenport Police Station. The sight of Officer Grant Sloan's cruiser parked out front filled him with relief. Grant had been his dad's best friend, practically family. If anyone could help, it was him. Bursting through the doors, Evan panted, "Grant, I need to talk to you. It's important." Grant looked up from his desk, his blue eyes softening with concern. "Evan, what's wrong?" Evan thrust his phone into Grant's hands. There's something happening at the old mill. People tied up, crates of, I don't even know what. I got it on video. You have to do something." Grant watched the footage, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "You did the right thing coming to me. Stay here. I'll take care of it." Relief flooded Evan's chest. "Thanks, Grant. I knew I could count on you." But as Grant's eyes flicked to the phone one last time, a shadow of something unspoken passed over his face. The cold night air stung Evan's skin as he leaned against the squad car outside. Minutes passed, then hours. Unease began to creep in. Suddenly, Grant appeared. "Evan, come with me. We need to talk." Evan hesitated but followed. Grant led him to a secluded stretch of road on the outskirts of town. The tension in the car was suffocating. "What's going on?" Evan finally asked, his voice shaking. Grant pulled over, cutting the engine. He turned to Evan, his practiced smile gone. You should have stayed out of it, kid. Evan's stomach dropped. What are you talking about? Before he could react, Grant's fist collided with his temple. The world went black. When Evan came to, the sky above him was painted with the first hints of dawn. He was lying in a ditch, his head pounding and his phone nowhere to be seen. Distant footsteps crunched on gravel. A jogger's startled voice called out, "Hey, are you okay?" Marianne Collins' hands trembled as she clutched her phone, the words from the hospital nurse ringing in her ears. Evan's been brought in. He's stable, but unconscious. When she arrived at the hospital, her eyes found him immediately. Her boy, pale and bruised, lay motionless on the bed. She sat beside him, brushing his hair back. "I'm here, Evan," she whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." Grant's arrival startled her. "Marianne," he said gently, his voice low. "I'm so sorry this happened. We'll find out who did this." Marianne nodded, but something about his demeanor felt off. His words were kind, yet his posture was tense, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. When Grant left, Marianne leaned closer to her son. "What happened to you, Evan? What were you trying to tell me?" Her mind raced with questions. Something wasn't right, and she was determined to find out the truth. The faint beeping of machines pulled Evan back into consciousness. His head throbbed, and his vision blurred as he blinked against the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room. He tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced him back onto the bed. "Easy, sweetheart." Marianne's voice was soft but firm. She leaned forward, her tired green eyes scanning his face. "You're safe now. Just rest." Evan swallowed, his throat dry. What happened?" Marianne brushed his hair back gently. "You were hurt, honey. Found in a ditch by a jogger. The doctors said you have a concussion. You'll be okay, but you need to take it slow." Memories began flooding back. The warehouse, the phone, Grant. His chest tightened. "Mom, I need to tell you something." Before he could continue, the door opened and Grant Sloan stepped in. "Hey, champ," Grant said, his voice filled with feigned concern. "How are you feeling?" Evan froze, his pulse quickening. I'm fine," he mumbled, avoiding Grant's gaze. Marianne looked between them, her brow furrowed. "Grant, thank you for checking in, but maybe now's not the best time. Evan needs rest." Grant nodded, his smile unwavering. "Of course. Just wanted to make sure he was okay." He lingered for a moment before stepping out, leaving an uncomfortable silence in his wake. Evan turned to his mother, his voice urgent. "Mom, I need to talk to you. Alone." The following morning, Marianne sat in the kitchen, her coffee untouched. Evan's words from the night before replayed in her mind. "Grant isn't who you think he is." He'd shared everything. The warehouse, the video, the betrayal. Marianne's hands shook as she dialed a number. "Hi, Carol. It's Marianne. Can we talk?" Carol, a fellow officer's wife, was one of the few people Marianne trusted. Over coffee at the local diner, Marianne recounted what Evan had told her. Carol's face paled. "Are you sure about this, Marianne?" "Grant, he's always been so." "I know how it sounds," Marianne interrupted, "but Evan wouldn't lie about something like this. And my gut, it's telling me he's right." Carol hesitated. "You have to be careful. If what you're saying is true, and Grant's involved in something dangerous, you could be putting yourself in harm's way." Marianne nodded, her resolve hardening. "I have to protect my son. I'll do whatever it takes." Grant's office was quiet as he sifted through a stack of files. His phone buzzed, and he answered immediately. "Yeah, "We've got a problem," a voice growled on the other end. "The kid. He's alive." Grant's jaw tightened. "I know. I'm handling it. Handle it faster. The warehouse is compromised. We're moving the operation tonight." Grant's grip on the phone tightened. "Fine. Just make sure there's nothing left for anyone to find." As the call ended, he leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Marianne was asking too many questions, and Evan was a liability. He needed to act before they unraveled everything. Evan's head still throbbed, but his mind was clearer. Marianne sat beside him, holding his hand. "Mom, you have to believe me," he said, his voice steady. "Grant is involved in this. He's not who he says he is." Marianne's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I believe you, Evan, but we have to be smart about this. We can't take him down on our own." "What do we do?" Evan asked. Marianne's jaw tightened. "We go to someone who can help, someone we can trust." Marianne stood in the mayor's office, her hands clutching a folder filled with everything she'd managed to uncover. Mayor Langston, an old friend of Liam's, listened intently as she spoke. "This is serious, Marianne," he said, flipping through the folder. "If what you're saying is true, we'll need federal help." He picked up his phone and dialed. "Agent Mia Drake, please." An hour later, Agent Drake arrived. She was sharp-eyed and professional, her presence commanding the room. "Mrs. Collins, Mayor Langston filled me in. I'd like to hear it from you." Marianne recounted everything, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. Evan sat beside her, his gaze fixed on the floor. Agent Drake nodded. "Thank you for coming forward. We'll protect you both. But this is just the beginning. Taking down someone like Grant requires evidence. Are you willing to help us gather it?" Marianne glanced at Evan, who met her eyes with determination. "We're in," she said firmly. Agent Mia Drake sat in the Collins' modest living room, her laptop open and surrounded by stacks of old files and case notes. Marianne paced the room, her hands gripping a steaming mug of tea, while Evan sat on the couch, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. "So," Mia began, her voice calm but firm, "I've been going through the records Liam kept before his death. It's clear he suspected Grant's involvement in something, but the details are vague. Did he ever mention anything to either of you?" Marianne paused. "He was preoccupied those last few months. He'd come home late, distracted. When I asked, he'd say it was just work. But now—" She shook her head, her voice breaking. "I wish I'd pushed harder." Evan's voice was low. "He used to tell me that some people couldn't be trusted. I thought he was just talking about strangers, not his own partner." Mia's gaze softened. "He was trying to protect you both. But the fact that he kept these notes means he didn't trust the system either." She tapped on her keyboard, pulling up an image of a symbol, a black circle with intersecting lines. "Does this mean anything to you?" Evan leaned forward. "I saw that on the crates at the warehouse. It was everywhere." Mia nodded, her expression grim. "It's the mark of a trafficking syndicate we've been tracking for years. This confirms Liam was onto something big, and it's why he was killed." Marianne's grip tightened on her mug. "Then we'll finish what he started." Evan sat at the dining table with Mia, a notebook in front of him. He tapped the pen against the page, frustration evident on his face. "Take your time," Mia said gently. "Even small details can help." He closed his eyes, forcing himself to focus. The images from that night flashed in his mind. The dim light, the stacks of crates, the armed men. "There were symbols painted on the crates," he said slowly. "The same one you showed us. And I heard one of the men say something about moving the product to another location." Mia's brow furrowed. Did they say where? Evan shook his head. No, but I remember the smell. It was chemical, like paint or something. And the floor was sticky, like oil. Mia jotted down his observations. Good. That's a lead. I'll have our team look into industrial sites nearby that match that description. Evan looked at her, determination hardening his features. They killed my dad. I won't let them get away with it. Grant Sloan paced his office, his polished demeanor cracking under the pressure. The phone on his desk buzzed, and he snatched it up. What now? He barked. The FBI is sniffing around, a voice replied. And the Collins kid's memory is sharper than we thought. Grant slammed his fist on the desk. I told you to handle it. How hard can it be? It's not that simple. They've got resources we can't counter. Grant gritted his teeth. Then we move faster. Relocate everything. And make sure there's no trail left behind. What about the kid? Grant's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. Leave that to me. Marianne sat by Evan's hospital bed, her knitting needles clicking softly as she tried to distract herself. Evan had insisted on staying overnight for observation, and she wasn't leaving his side. A soft knock on the door drew her attention. A nurse peeked in. Mrs. Collins, there's someone here to see you. Marianne frowned. At this hour? Who is it? He didn't give his name, but he said it's urgent. Alarm bells rang in Marianne's mind. Tell him to wait. I'll be out in a moment. As the nurse left, Marianne turned to Evan. Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone except me. Evan nodded, his face pale. Be careful, Mom. Steeling herself, Marianne stepped into the hallway. A man in a security uniform stood near the nurse's station. Something about him seemed off, his stance too rigid, his gaze too focused. Can I help you? Marianne asked, her voice firm. The man smirked. Actually, you can. Before he could continue, Agent Mia Drake emerged from the elevator, flanked by two agents. Ma'am, step away, Mia commanded. The man's smirk vanished as he bolted toward the exit. The agents pursued him, leaving Marianne shaken but unharmed. Mia turned to her. Are you okay? Marianne nodded. What was that? A warning, Mia said grimly. They know we're close. Back at the FBI field office, Mia and her team worked tirelessly. Maps and photographs covered the walls, with red pins marking potential locations. Evan sat beside Marianne, his gaze fixed on the activity. An agent approached Mia, handing her a file. We found a match. An old paint factory on the outskirts of town. Fits the description the boy gave. Mia studied the file, then looked at Evan. This could be it. Are you sure you're ready for what comes next? Evan's eyes met hers, unwavering. Yes, I have to be. Marianne placed a hand on his shoulder. We're with you, Evan. All the way. The chapter closes with the team preparing for a raid, the tension palpable as they inch closer to uncovering the truth and bringing justice to Liam's legacy. The FBI briefing room buzzed with energy as agents crowded around a central table. Maps, surveillance photos, and intel reports were scattered across its surface. Agent Mia Drake stood at the front, her posture commanding, as she addressed the team. We have confirmation that the syndicate's operation has relocated to the old Pinevale paint factory, she began, her voice steady. It's remote, heavily guarded, and has multiple points of entry. This will not be a simple in and out. Marianne and Evan sat in the corner, observers in this sea of precision. Evan's leg bounced nervously, but his eyes stayed locked on Mia. Agent Drake. A man raised his hand. What's the plan for minimizing collateral damage? If the traffickers are armed, they might use the captives as leverage. Mia nodded. That's our biggest concern. Teams Alpha and Bravo will focus on securing the hostages. Team Charlie will handle perimeter control and any fleeing suspects. We have thermal imaging that suggests there are at least 15 captives inside. Our priority is their safety. Marianne leaned over to Evan, whispering, "Are you sure you want to do this?" Evan didn't look away from Mia. "I have to. For Dad." Mia's gaze fell on them. "Evan, Marianne, if either of you has doubts, now's the time to speak up." Evan stood, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. "They took everything from us. I'm ready." Mia's expression softened. "Then let's get to work." Night blanketed the countryside as black SUVs cut through the dark, their headlights off to avoid detection. The Pinevale Paint Factory loomed ahead, its rusted facade illuminated by floodlights stationed around the perimeter. Inside one of the SUVs, Evan sat between Marianne and Mia. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the hum of the engine. Mia handed Evan a comm device. "Keep this on you," she instructed. "You'll stay in the vehicle until we secure the building. If anything goes wrong, call for help immediately." Evan nodded, slipping the device into his pocket. "I just want to see them pay." Marianne gripped his hand tightly. "You've done enough already, Evan. Just stay safe." The convoy halted a quarter-mile from the factory. Agents disembarked, donning tactical gear and checking weapons. Mia signaled for silence, her hand raised. Through night vision goggles, the factory's activity became clear. Guards patrolled the perimeter, rifles slung over their shoulders. Trucks were being loaded, their contents obscured. Mia's voice crackled softly through the comms. "Team Alpha, move to position. Team Bravo, prepare for breach. Charlie, hold perimeter." The teams melted into the shadows, their movements silent and precise. Evan watched from the SUV, his heart pounding. The first explosion shattered the stillness. A flashbang erupted near the main entrance, disorienting the guards. Shouts and gunfire followed as Team Alpha stormed inside. Evan craned his neck, straining to see through the chaos. "Target secured," an agent's voice blared over the comms. "Hostages located. They're in the north wing." Inside the factory, Mia led the charge, her firearm steady. She found the hostages huddled in a corner, their hands bound, faces streaked with grime and fear. "FBI," Mia announced, kneeling to cut their restraints. "You're safe now. Stay low and follow my team." Suddenly, a hail of bullets ricocheted off the metal walls. "We've got company," another agent shouted. Mia returned fire, her team advancing methodically. Grant Sloan watched the monitors in a makeshift control room, sweat beading on his forehead. The raid was more coordinated than he'd anticipated. He barked orders into his radio. "Fall back. Take the trucks and get out of here." One of his lieutenants hesitated. "But the product." "Forget the product," Grant snapped. "Save yourselves." As his men scrambled, Grant grabbed a duffel bag filled with cash and documents. He slipped out a back exit, vanishing into the dense woods surrounding the factory. Evan's comm device crackled. "Suspect fleeing on foot toward the east perimeter," a voice reported. Evan's blood ran cold. He knew who they meant. "Stay here," Marianne ordered, her tone brooking no argument. But Evan's resolve hardened. "I can't," he whispered, slipping out of the SUV before she could stop him. He sprinted toward the woods, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Adrenaline drowned out the fear as he followed the sound of crashing branches and hurried footsteps. In the distance, he spotted Grant, the beam of his flashlight catching the man's face. Grant froze for a moment before raising a pistol. "Evan," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You should have stayed out of this. You killed my dad," Evan shouted, his voice shaking but firm. "You're not getting away." Before Grant could respond, Mia appeared, her weapon drawn. "Drop it, Sloan," she commanded. Grant's eyes darted between them before he lowered his gun, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "It's over," Mia said, cuffing him. "You've lost." Evan stepped closer, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "Why?" he demanded. "You were supposed to protect us. Why did you do it?" Grant met his gaze, a flicker of regret in his eyes. "Because your father wouldn't bend, and I couldn't afford to lose everything." The morning sun filtered through the curtains of the Collins' modest living room as Evan sat at the dining table, a thick file of papers in front of him. His hands trembled slightly as he leafed through the pages, depositions, evidence, and notes compiled by the FBI. Marianne placed a steaming cup of tea beside him. "You've been staring at that for hours," she said softly. "Take a break, sweetheart." "I can't," Evan replied, his voice tight. "I need to know everything. If I mess up my testimony—" "You won't," she interrupted, sitting across from him. Her green eyes, weary but steadfast, locked onto his. "You're stronger than you think. You've already survived more than most people ever could." Evan exhaled shakily. I want to do Dad proud." Marianne reached across the table, her hand covering his. "You already have." The knock at the door interrupted their moment. It was Agent Mia Drake, looking sharp and determined as always. "Ready to head to the courthouse?" she asked. Evan stood, squaring his shoulders. "As I'll ever be." The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Evan sat in the witness chair, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on him. Across the room, Grant Sloan sat at the defense table, his polished smile replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "Mr. Collins," the prosecutor began, "can you recount the events of the evening when you discovered the warehouse?" Evan's voice was steady as he described the horrifying scene. The bound captives, the armed men, the evidence of the trafficking operation. He spoke of his decision to trust Grant and the betrayal that followed. "When I gave Officer Sloan my phone, I thought I was safe," Evan said, his gray eyes narrowing as he turned toward Grant. "But he wasn't there to help me. He knocked me out and left me in a ditch." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Grant's attorney objected, but the judge overruled, allowing Evan to continue. "He destroyed my phone, the evidence. He told me I'd never see my mom again if I said anything, but I survived. And I'm here to make sure he pays for what he did." As Evan finished, he caught a glimpse of Marianne in the gallery. Her expression was a mix of pride and sorrow, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across the room, Grant's mask of indifference faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of anger. The jury deliberated for hours, but when they returned, their verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all charges. Gasps and whispered exclamations filled the room as the judge read the sentence. Life in prison without parole. Grant's composure finally cracked. He stood abruptly, shouting, "You think this changes anything? The system is still rotten. You'll never win," before being restrained by bailiffs. Evan watched in silence, a sense of bittersweet relief washing over him. The man who had betrayed his family, who had stained his father's legacy, was finally held accountable. As the courtroom emptied, Mia approached Evan and Marianne. "You did it," she said, her voice warm. "Your testimony was the nail in the coffin." Evan nodded, the weight of the ordeal still heavy on his shoulders. "It's not just about him. It's about everyone who was hurt by this. Mia placed a hand on his shoulder. "And because of you, they'll finally get justice." That evening, Marianne and Evan visited the cemetery, the cool breeze carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. They stood before Liam's grave, the headstone simple yet dignified. Marianne knelt, placing a bouquet of white lilies at the base. "He'd be so proud of you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Evan swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I just wish he were here." "He is," Marianne replied, standing and wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "In everything you do, Evan, you're the best parts of him." They stood in silence, the fading sunlight casting long shadows over the cemetery. For the first time in months, Evan felt a glimmer of peace. Back at home, the atmosphere was lighter. Marianne hummed softly as she prepared dinner, while Evan flipped through a book on criminal justice. He looked up, his stormy eyes clear and focused. "I've been thinking," he said. "I want to become a cop, like Dad." Marianne paused, turning to face him. "Are you sure? It's a dangerous path." "I know," he said, his voice resolute, "but I want to help people, to make sure no one else has to go through what we did." She smiled, a mixture of pride and apprehension on her face. "Then I'll support you, every step of the way." As they sat down to eat, the weight of their shared grief began to lift, replaced by a sense of purpose. They were no longer just surviving. They were healing, together. The FBI field office buzzed with activity. Agents moved with purpose, pinning maps and photos to corkboards while others debriefed in hurried tones. Evan sat in a corner beside Mia Drake, watching the scene unfold. "Do you see this?" Mia said, tapping a report on the desk. "Coordinated raids across 6 states. We've arrested over 40 individuals in just 3 days. Judges, CEOs, politicians. This syndicate was operating at a level none of us could have imagined." Evan stared at the report. "And it all started with that night at the warehouse," he said quietly. "I didn't know it was this big." Mia gave him a small smile. "Most people wouldn't have survived what you went through, let alone had the courage to speak up. This all started because of you, Evan." Marianne entered the room, a rare smile lighting her face. "Agent Drake, I just spoke with Mayor Langston. He's arranging a press conference to announce the arrests." Evan looked up. "I'm not great with speeches." Marianne chuckled. "You don't have to speak, sweetheart. Just be there. The world needs to see the face of the boy who stood up to corruption." Evan shifted uncomfortably, but Mia's reassuring pat on his shoulder steadied him. "You've already done the hard part," she said. "This is just the victory lap." The press conference took place in Havenport's Central Square, the modest podium flanked by FBI agents and local officials. A small crowd gathered, murmurs of disbelief rippling through the town as the arrests were announced. Mayor Langston stepped up to the microphone. "Today marks a turning point for our community. The dark underbelly that threatened our safety has been exposed. This could not have happened without the bravery of one young man, Evan Collins." Applause broke out as Evan hesitantly approached the podium, flanked by Marianne. He didn't speak, but the crowd's cheers spoke volumes. Among the faces in the crowd, Evan noticed a mix of emotions: shock, anger, guilt. He caught the eye of his teacher, Mr. Baker, who gave him a proud nod. In contrast, Mrs. Caldwell from the corner store wiped away tears, muttering something about never trusting Grant again. Marianne leaned close and whispered, "They're processing everything, just like we are." Evan nodded. "I just hope they'll stop pretending this kind of thing doesn't happen in places like this." Weeks later, Evan stood in the community center's small gymnasium, speaking to a group of teenagers. Posters line the walls, each detailing warning signs of human trafficking and resources for reporting. "You don't have to be a superhero," Evan said, his voice steady. "Just pay attention. If something feels off, trust your gut and tell someone you trust." A girl in the back raised her hand. "Weren't you scared?" Evan smiled faintly, terrified. But fear isn't a bad thing. It's what you do with it that matters. As the session ended, Marianne entered, carrying a tray of cookies. "You're quite the speaker," she teased, handing him one. "I'm just glad they're listening," Evan said. "If even one of them speaks up when something's wrong, it'll be worth it." Marianne's expression softened. "Your father would be so proud." Marianne sat at the kitchen table, poring over brochures from organizations supporting trafficking survivors. She circled one in bold red ink, Hope Haven Resource Center. "You're serious about this?" Evan asked as he joined her. She looked up, determination in her green eyes. "I've spent so much time grieving, Evan. It's time to do something meaningful. I can't change what happened to your dad, but I can help others." Evan nodded. "You've always been good at taking care of people." Marianne smiled. "Guess it runs in the family." On a crisp autumn evening, Evan and Marianne sat on the porch, sipping hot cocoa as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, a peaceful contrast to the chaos they'd endured. "Do you ever think about what Dad would say if he were here?" Evan asked. Marianne sighed, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "All the time, but I think he'd tell us exactly what we needed to hear. Keep going, keep fighting, never give up on doing what's right." Evan smiled, the weight on his shoulders feeling lighter than it had in months. "I think I finally get it now. Why he did what he did. It wasn't just about justice, it was about hope." Marianne reached over, taking his hand. "And you've carried that hope forward, Evan. More than you know." As the last light faded, they sat in comfortable silence, the darkness no longer something to fear, but a backdrop for the brighter days ahead. Did you know that nearly half of human trafficking cases worldwide are linked to corruption within trusted institutions? It's a chilling reminder of how betrayal can hide behind the masks of authority. In Evan's journey, we saw how even more trustworthy figures can destroy faith, and how finding out the truth can change everything. What would you do if someone you trust was part of something so dark? Share your thoughts in the comments below. How would you fight for justice in a world full of hidden shadows? Call to subscribe and follow more content. If stories like Evan's inspire you to question, reflect, and act, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Join us for more moving narratives that dive deep into human resilience, uncovering hidden truths and the fight for justice. Together, we will explore stories that challenge us and inspire us to make a difference.